The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Alex and I am welcomed today by a fantastic tutor called Jeff Cordwell. Just before we get stuck into uncovering the examiner's comments for performance management, just a general little bit of housekeeping. If you do have any issues with the GoToWebinar platform when you are watching this live, please just refresh, come back in. It will be recorded, so you can also watch it back and distribute as you see fit to your ACCA community and fellow students. The session will last just around an hour. We will be doing questions at the end, but feel free as you go along to put your questions into the question panel on the platform, and I'll be able to deal with any sort of technical questions as well as specific ones around performance management. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to Jeff. I'll be getting involved intermittently when Jeff sort of brings me in, but he's the main man for today. Thank you very much, Jeff, for joining us. Away we go.
Well, welcome everybody. My name is Jeff Cordwell, and you can see me in camera. I'm a little bit off center there, and that's what I look like in real life. Although I have to say my hair is a lot longer than it was 5 months ago, the last time I had it cut. There is my LinkedIn. I mean, I would encourage you to join me on that LinkedIn. There's a couple of interesting groups in there as well. I've got an ACCA APM group and also an ACCA PM group where I share tips and so forth. So I'm an online lecturer. I've been, I suppose, doing that since the COVID situation. It's obviously changing the marketplaces. So I'm a freelance tutor and consultant. I've had a lot of experience with the ACCA over the years. I did train the trainer in Bangladesh, train the trainer in Pakistan. That was quite interesting. Went to South Africa. And I've also taught extensively actually in the Middle East, in Dubai. So I'm long in the tooth. Originally I was trained in Kaplan in 1984. Yes, I did say that right, 1984. So that's a long time ago. And I'm still doing this because I absolutely love it. Now what we're going to do here is just talk a little bit about performance management. From what Alex says, there's a very wide mix of people in this virtual room. Some of you are just starting PM and some of you may have already started PM. So we are going to do a little bit of an introduction and also a little bit of a session on getting started, assuming, I suppose, that at least some of you are going to be studying PM shortly towards presumably maybe the December exams or possibly even the September exams if you're feeling ambitious. So we're going to do that. We're also going to look at the main point of this, which is this thing here, the examiner's comments. The examiner's comments aren't, we don't think, read by enough people. They include all sorts of very useful information coming straight, if you like, from the horse's mouth. I've written examiner's comments in the past, and they tell people where the frustrations of the examiner are, and I can assure you if the examiner is frustrated about an individual topic or an approach, one, they'll say so and give you tips about being better, and secondly, they're almost certain to examine that again. I remember years ago there was a linear programming question where part A was attempted, but part B and C, which were about shadow prices, simply weren't attempted, and so the response was to write an article that was published and then examine it again. So the examiner's comments are incredibly useful, not only as a reflection, if you like, of what's happened in the past, but also, looking forward as to what's coming in the future. From those examiner's comments, what I've done is I've picked out maybe 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, I don't know exactly, but get some generic tips and comments for you to reflect on and what might be useful, okay, including a couple of OT examples. Alex is then going to come back and talk about study support. I mean, the ACCA is a fantastic organisation, it really is. Spends an awful lot of time and money trying to support individual students and collective students, and there's a lot of resources available. It's very, very professional, and you ought to make as much use of it as possible. What we're hoping, of course, is that there's a Q&A session at the end and you can ask us any questions you like. So I hope that's all clear. That's what we're going to do. Let's just talk briefly about how the performance management syllabus sort of sets out. And you can see here you've got this rather elaborate looking diagram, a bit more complicated than it perhaps needs to be. And that's not, I didn't mean to say it like that, but it looks more complicated than it really is. That's a better way of seeing it. On the left-hand side, you can see you've got information technologies and systems there, information technology. And of course, that transcends the whole of the central column. So you might well have questions around IT and IS to do with basic management accounting, or to do with decision-making techniques, or to do with budgeting and control. Yeah, and so these central themes in the middle here are all supported, if you like, by the left-hand side. So that can be examined in any way. And these core areas, your basic management accounts is very important. We'll talk about how that relates to the management accounting paper at the lower level in a moment. To support you through decision making. I mean, surely good performance is partly about making good decisions. You make a good decision, performance, if you like, follows naturally. But also, presumably, about the thing about performance is it has to be controlled. So you make a budget, you record an actual, you measure variances, and therefore that's why, if you like, the third little box there is to do with, budgeting techniques, planning and control, including variances. Right, so you've got your basic management accounting, provide the information, you've got some making good decisions, and then you've got some control on the end. Now the whole of that effectively feeds into the right-hand side here, the performance measurement and control. And I remember when this syllabus was set up, I certainly viewed that as being a really important area, and every exam would have a question out of what is now, if you like, section E of the syllabus, and that's still true. So you are going to get a question in section E in every paper. Yeah, and how would you actually assess the performance of the business, for example, might appear in there, and that's increasingly common. Now, if we reflect for a moment on where Performance Manager sits, there's obviously 3 papers on the right-hand side there which sit in a line, and you've got your, if you like, your basic paper, the management accounting. Yeah, you've got the middle paper, the performance management, and then you've got the top paper, advanced performance management. Now, the management accounting, I suppose, provides your basic information in order to do performance management. And I think when we introduced the syllabus a long time ago, admittedly, back in 2010, I think it was. No, wait a minute. Yeah, about 2010. The basic management accounting wasn't developed into how do you assess performance. So you might do a variance calculation, or you might do a costing calculation, but there's no implications. And that, to some extent, was what performance management was all about. Do the calculations and then say, what does this mean to performance? Who is not performing well? In what areas do we need to improve? And there was a big shift between management accounting, which provides the basic information, and performance management, which says, can we use this information to perform better? And so the management accounts provides the basic information. The performance management at the middle level takes it so far, i.e. we might, for example, comment on performance, but we might not suggest how we might improve performance. Improving performance tends to be as part of advanced performance management, which I would say is an excellent paper to study. If you're in business and you're thinking about running a business, the advanced performance management is an excellent choice. It just makes sure that all your organization is pulling in the same directions, yeah, so that they're all trying to make sure that we're making money and not pulling against each other. Advanced performance management is more systematic. Now, Alex is going to talk briefly about how performance management not only leads into APM, but might also lead into strategic business leader.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you, Jeff. And I think the point there you mentioned about, the performance management papers leading towards the other exams is really sort of poignant, because a lot of times students might decide to come through an exemptions route, or they might actually, even forget what they've learned before. And I can empathize with that. Myself and you have both studied and taught these exams for many years, and sometimes you can go, I'll put my SBL hat on, I'll put my performance management hat down. Well, actually, you really can't afford to do that, because there is overlap between the exams. So some of the areas like control, managerial accountancy feed in from performance management into strategic business leader. Now, strategic business leader is an integrated case study, and it's one of your essentials at the strategic professional level. So you have to do that exam. So you have to retain some of your managerial performance management accountancy knowledge. And what's fantastic about it as well is if you then do your strategic business leader exam, it also leads really well and interacts with the advanced performance management option paper, because They're both from a very senior director's leadership position within an organisation, and therefore they help each other with knowledge and also, to some extent, the exam technique that interacts across the entire ACCA qualification. So that's how SBL fits into it. You gain a lot of knowledge from SBL that also feeds into your other exams. Jeff, if you could move on to the next slide, just a little bit on managerial accounting. One of the sort of ways that I like to visualize and get students to engage with is the reasons why you can't just go around forgetting things per exam. It's a bit like a management accountancy toolbox, and I like this analogy because you wouldn't expect a tradesperson, a plumber, a joiner, an electrician to turn up for a job without any of the tools in their kit, or with just some of them. I mean, maybe in reality that might happen, but truth be told, best practice would be for them to turn up with all the necessary tools. So you can't afford to just think, oh, well, I don't need to remember anything about costing or budgeting, because you will need them on the next exams. So if you do management accountancy, then performance management, then SBL, and then advanced performance management, you do need to retain from your managerial accountancy toolbox many of the skills that you've learned along the way. Thank you very much, Jeff. Back over to you.
Okay, thank you. Now, the performance management structure of the paper has changed over the years, and what you're now faced with is 3 sections, A, B, and C. Section A and B, as you can see on the screen there, I think, are both objective testing driven. That doesn't mean, of course, multiple choice. It might mean multiple entry. It might mean number entry. And one of the helps that ACCA give you is indications of how these things can be tested in different ways. The old-fashioned multiple choice exam is long gone, and it's much more involved. So you get 15 objective questions worth 2 marks, and then in section B, for another 30 marks, you then get 3 questions, all with 5 OT questions each. They're quite interesting, these. They have a little scenario at the beginning and then 5 related questions, all to do with that scenario. One of the rules here, by the way, is that when for example, in part B of that, you might have to work out contribution, the ACCA have set their own rules here to say that the answer to that question can't be a fundamental part of a subsequent question. So all the questions have to be independent. And the reason for that is so that you're not punished by not being able to do, if you like, part B, yeah, and therefore you won't be able to do part C either, if that depending upon the information. Hope that makes sense. So it often means, funnily enough, that in parts 3, 4, and 5, there are 3 questions, A, B, C, D, and E. So parts C, D, and E, sometimes those questions get a bit easier, really, and that's good technique to recognise that. You've got a 5-part sort of questions. Don't forget, part D and part E can often be wordy type questions, a little bit more straightforward. Indeed, on that point, I would also say that, you know, section A and section B, there are, 60 marks for the exam. 30 of them normally are more written in nature and not calculation by nature. Now, obviously, everybody has their own strengths and weaknesses. It could well be that you're good with numbers. I mean, you should be reasonably good with numbers. You're trying to become an accountant after all. But equally, the wordy questions, although they're not easy, they're certainly quicker to do. Yeah, and do bear that in mind. So from a technique point of view, sometimes it's very sensible to actually work the wordy questions first in priority, yeah, and in order to give you a little bit more time with the numbers. Or if you work them in order, do recognize that, you can spend a bit more time on the numbers because you'll catch up on the wordy parts. That makes sense. So 60% of this exam is objectively tested, and I've certainly got some help later on, some advice from me effectively about how you might approach that in the last session that we're going to do today. Section C is 2 scenarios, 2 questions each, probably 20 marks each, normally 20 marks each, which will have 1 or more requirement. So although it's 20 marks, there might be an A and a B and a C as part of that. Yeah, I've always looked at that and thought, well, that's the key of the exam. But of course, with objective testing, the whole syllabus is covered, sorry. And that's a real problem. It's a big syllabus, is performance management. You're going to have to study quite hard. But in section C, you get questions relating, for example, to performance measurement. You get questions on non-financial indicators of performance, things like the balanced scorecard or the building block model. You get questions on possibly on variances. the advanced variances, so that's to do with things like mix and yield variances, or planning and operational variances. Or you might get a question on decision making. These are the core areas of the syllabus: performance assessment, non-financial indicators, variances, decision making, and possibly budgeting. I would say if you can make sure you can cover those 4 or 5 things, then section C normally is covered for you. There might be something a little bit more unusual, a bit more off the beaten track in section C, but it will never be 20 marks. It'll be a part C of a question talking about a little bit of life cycle costing, for example. And then I would also stress there actually that although this is a big syllabus, it's examined very fairly. In my experience, all the meetings that we ever had in the examining panel was to do with making the exam fair, making the exam reasonable. There's no one's trying to let you fail here. They want you to get through this, let me assure you. Yeah, so it will be fair, and we'll talk about why that's relevant to you a bit later on. Now, if you just take a step back for a moment and say, okay, let's assume for the moment you are just starting out. How do you start? Where do you start to look at? And an awful lot of people think, oh, well, what I ought to do is look at the syllabus. And I would say that was a mistake. I would say the first place to start is to actually have a look at the specimen paper, yeah, or, and perhaps better than that, 1 or 2 past exams. And all you don't have to do the whole thing. You don't have to work them, because at this point, of course, you won't know what all these terms mean. But certainly what you need to do is have a look at the requirements. And what that tells you is never mind what's in the syllabus, what's coming up regularly, and importantly, how is it being examined? How is it being examined? Is it that you've got to produce a budget, or have you got to critique a budget? If variances are coming up, which variances are coming up and in what way? How many marks are available in which areas? And it gives you a really solid feel for your preparation. There's no point in studying a peripheral area of the exam that only ever has been examined once for 2 marks 5 years ago, and you spend 3 days on it. What's the point of that? Yeah. Equally, the ACCA, as I mentioned before, provide a huge amount of guidance. Specifically, we're talking about today, the examiner's reports. These things are incredibly useful, and we'll get to that in a short moment, really. By all means, have a look at the syllabus and the study guide. Nobody wants to be surprised. But I assure you, if you look at the specimen paper in the past exams and you read the examiner's reports and you concentrate on what's important, you've got more than enough to pass. And the peripheral areas, yes, you should study them. I'm not suggesting for a moment that you shouldn't, but you really need to focus on what's important, really. And again, I think we'll talk about this a bit in a moment. There's lots and lots of study support videos and videos on exam technique and syllabus updating and all sorts of things on the ACCA. You should be on the ACCA website regularly. It's very, very, very useful. Now, that's just a very brief introduction of where you should start your preparation. Start with the past exams. Yeah, have a look at the examiner's reports and examiner's comments and the examining team's guidance. Maybe read the odd article on some key topics, because articles are produced all the time. They're really useful. One technique, I know this is true, one technique is that examiners will use is that they will write an article because they want to set a question. And they want to set a question, let's say, in 18 months' time. So let's put out an article to give people a chance to absorb a new idea, for example. So you'd be crazy not to be looking at the examiner's articles. Certainly if they're written by the examining panel and not written by a third-party person like me, for example. Yeah, if they're written by the examining panel, the examiner's probably had a first hand in it. Okay. So in preparation for this, obviously I read the examiner's comments, if you like, quite regularly anyway, but I did have a nice Saturday morning last weekend, catching up a little bit, having a look round and seeing what they said. And what I thought I would do is to some extent summarize what's generally in examiners' comments, and then have a look at 1 or 2 specific things that have been talked about quite recently. And certainly from your point of view, if you're just preparing to do PM or about to do PM in December or possibly even March 2021, this is entirely relevant. Now, these things are written every sitting. I find it inconceivable that it wouldn't have the input, at least the input from the examiner themselves. There's an examining panel, and that's made up of a variety of different people. For example, there's an assessor who just checks that the exam is sensible. There's a subject coordinator who makes sure that the PM exam isn't treading on the toes of another paper, for instance. There's obviously the examiner themselves, and that makes up, if you like, the examining panel. There may well be other people involved in that, but ultimately the examiner's comments is going to be written by someone very senior in that examining panel. And I consider it to be inconceivable the examiner has not at least had a look at it, if not written it themselves. So they're very important. It's very important to sort of visualize this, if you like, from a personal perspective. The examiner has a reason for examining something and has a feeling and a belief. And if you can understand what they're after, they're incredibly useful. Now, the ACCA have a policy not to release all the papers all the time. And certainly in the PM paper, they don't release many of the OT items, just a couple each sitting in the examiner's report, funnily enough. And in section C, you might only get one of the two questions issued, on a 6 monthly cycle. But if you read the examiner's comments, interestingly, I found it was usually pretty obvious what sort of questions came up every time without necessarily being able to see the question itself. So it's giving you a fairly strong hint as to what was examined each individual time. I'm not a great supporter of, question spotting, if you like, although I like to give tips. I like to think occasionally I get them right. It's very difficult to do that. But nonetheless, at least you know what came up last time and the time before, and your last minute revision, if you like, you can concentrate on things that perhaps have got a better chance of coming up this time. I think what's important about the examiner's comments at this moment is to say that it tends to deal with specific problems in a diet. Specific problems in the diet where the examiner probably was disappointed. I remember an old question on linear programming where part A was done by the majority of students, but parts B and C was not attempted. And in the examiner's report, it was commented on. And you know what's going to happen then, because later on, what the examiner did was write another question based on part C and part B that was missed out of the first question. So the examiner's reports, if you're doing the exam, for example, in December, have a look at the examiner's reports in the previous June or the previous March, or even go back a year, go back further. Part of the reason I would suggest you go back further than you might think is because the ACCA have a process to prepare the exams. They're hugely organized and professional organization. They don't write the exam. The next exam, of course, is September. That wasn't written 3 months ago. That was probably written a year ago. So go back in time and have a look at the sort of things that were said this time last year about where the examiner, if you like, was disappointed. What technique issues did they mention? Because you can pretty much be certain that these things will come up again. And by the way, what normally happens in the examiner's comments these days is they give 2 examples of OT items that were particularly difficult. And it's nice because they chat through them. They talk about why it was difficult, what went wrong, and therefore what people can do to improve. Of course, you don't need to pass an exam. To pass an exam, you don't necessarily need to get the difficult ones right. What you need to do is get the easy ones right. There's normally in the PM exam, there's enough marks available that are accessible for everyone to pass. And if you can do that, that's perfectly okay. So I don't want to give you the impression that you must concentrate on the difficult areas. You really need to concentrate on the easy areas, frankly. And again, although they don't give you exactly what came up, they give you links to relevant past exam questions that have been published. Because you can imagine, given the ACCA's policy, it's quite tricky to write a report on an exam when you know a question is not going to be released to the general public. So what they tend to do is talk about it more generically. That's why you know the topic, and they'll give you relevant past exam questions as a link. Okay, so you can judge that. So, and again, it's about timing, isn't it? If you're doing the exam in September, what I would be doing is looking at last December or last September or last June's examiner's comments and seeing the sort of things that were commented on there, because that's in some ways more relevant to your paper, which was written a year ago. Okay. Equally, when I looked through the examiner's comments last weekend to remind myself of the sort of things that I'll be saying at the moment, you get the old chestnuts coming out all the time. For example, read the requirements first. Please recognise that in section C of the paper, there is a the way it generally looks is there's a scenario which will be a block of written word, and then a requirement, part A, part B. And so the requirement will provide exactly what the examiner wants you to do with the scenario information. Clearly, if you read the scenario information first, you don't really have a context for it. So this scenario information above here could lead you to think the question's about budgeting. It could lead you to think the question's about variances. But when you get to part A, it says, comment on the participation level in the budgeting process. Oh, so a quite slightly different feel for when you're reading the scenario. That's not to say the scenario's misleading. It's just that without the vital context for the scenario, which you see in the requirements, yeah, you can be misled. And the examiners have been consistent in that advice. Always read the requirements first. It provides a context to the scenario. Yeah. Equally interestingly, because I mentioned there that there might be a part A and then a part B. Sometimes the second requirement might give you a little bit of a hint about the approach you might need to take in part A. So using the information in part A, it might say in the second part, work out the total contribution lost. That sort of suggests then, therefore, part A is about contribution. It's not about profit, for example. So these reading the requirements is really important. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're going to look at past papers, reading the requirements, to be honest, is often all you need to do. You don't need to read the whole thing. What was the question about? Which angle did they take? Do I get a feel for how frequently something's coming up? What sort of context is it set in? And this point here is just it's astonishing, really, how often this goes wrong. The examiner increasingly makes comments on multi-parted requirements. So if I say to you, would you calculate and justify, or describe and explain? Yeah, when you've got two parts like that, or if you look at advantages and disadvantages, positives and negatives, or it might even be something that's more specific to a particular topic. Yeah, but the point is that you've got 2 requirements, and past history, I'm afraid, suggests that in that situation, most people will talk about the first requirement and completely ignore the second. Particularly interestingly, in calculate and justify. Calculate and justify. There might be 1 mark for the calculation, and there might be 1 mark for the justification. And if you're not doing both parts, if all you're doing is calculating and you're not justifying, then out of a 20-mark question, I'm afraid you can't score more than 10, can you? And that's a bit of a problem. You really could do with getting good marks in section C. It's not necessary. As long as you get 50 somewhere, it's perfectly okay. I'm not suggesting that you've got to score high in section C, but no question, one of the easiest things you can do to improve your score is be careful with multi-parted questions. Yeah, comment on the budgeting approach and variances approach. The moment you write a question like that, yeah, as a person that's written a lot of exam questions in the past, the moment you do that, people are only going to answer the first part. So sometimes I'll even put the word "and" in bold to stress that, because we know that's going to go wrong. And they don't want it to go wrong, but there was a vision for the examiner when they wrote the questions. So watch that very carefully. Yeah, but equally, don't go the other way. Don't go beyond a question. One thing I would say is that performance management in section C, when it talks about performance management and control systems, very often what you get is assess performance. If you think about a performance management paper, surely one of the key things is to assess the performance of the business. If we can't do that, having studied a performance management syllabus, then there's something very wrong. So in other words, if I give you a profit and loss account, I give you a balance sheet, potentially, mainly it's a P&L or an income statement in the modern language, an income statement, then as long as you can assess that, that's going to be good enough, but it's surely a core thing. Yeah, notice that assessing performance does not mean improve the performance. It does not mean make recommendations. It does not mean fix the problems. It does not mean suggest better ways of doing things. And unfortunately, if you do that at performance management, you will not score marks for that. If I ask you to assess performance, yeah, I'm not asking you to improve it, then any comments that you make on improving it will not score. In many ways, when PM was created and APM was created, one of the sort of agreements was the fact that APM would be the part where we start to test how to improve performance, because that's viewed to be a higher skill, and PM would be left to just assess the performance and leave the rest dangling, if you like, for next time. That makes sense. So be very, very careful with that. You know, I would say those 3 tips there, if you're sat there having done this exam before, for example, scoring yourself 45 for a frustrating mark, those 3 tips there almost certainly gets you the extra 5 or 6 marks that you need to pass. It's not complicated stuff. It's not technique that it's not technical knowledge rather that causes people to fail this very often. It's more technique, although it is a very technical exam, in fairness. Another point on performance assessment made in the examiner's comments quite regularly, is this. There are more marks for an explanation and the implications for something than for the calculation. There are more marks for an explanation and an implication. So for example, in section C, if you're asked to work out, I don't know, say a gross profit or a sales growth, it won't be necessarily a complicated thing. And if the sales growth, for example, is, let's say, 12%, telling me why that's happening, scores you many more marks than actually being able to do the calculation itself, because the calculation itself is very, very, very easy. And the implication of rapid growth, if you said something like, that might require more finance, that could be very good for dividends, or that could be extremely good for bonuses for the directors, then that's great. That's implications. Because if you think about it, what's an accountant for? An accountant is to make sense of the numbers for people that don't, if you like, ordinarily understand them. That's our role. So yes, so making an explanation and talking about implications are really important. And look, more marks. That's all we're interested in, isn't it? We want to pass. So do a calculation by all means and think to yourself, that's half a mark. But then think, can I say something about that is sensible? And the markers are giving quite a bit of leeway in terms of what makes sensibility. The examiner did say in the examiner's comments, far too many calculations. I think that's a product of the Excel spreadsheet world that we live in. A column for last year, a column for this year. You can work out the difference between the two. You could even do that as a percentage, and you just drag that formula down 400 cost headings, and we've got loads of information. But of course, in an exam, you might have the ability to do that in CBE, mightn't you? You can drag the formula down, but you're doing too many calculations, not enough thought. Don't do that. Calculate things that are important. And in particular, this point was made in 2 of the past examiners' comments reports that I read over the last few years and stuff. He said calculations are often better in percentages than in dollars. Of course it is. Of course it is. Saying 2 numbers are different by 5,000, or there's been a $5,000 increase in a number, is relatively meaningless because it depends on the size of the original number. 5,000 increase could be 50% of one cost, but 0.1% of another cost. So if it's 50% increase, we're very interested. If it's only 1%, we're not at all interested, really. It's a minor alteration. Equally, another same sort of thing in section C here, in variance analysis, you need a reason or a cause of that variance. Yeah, that goes beyond what sometimes people describe as a mathematical truth. So if you've got a material price variance, which is adverse, it obviously means that the material prices went up. So saying the material prices went up is not an explanation or a cause. It's a mathematical truth. Of course, the material prices have gone up. What you've got to do is tell the reader why that could be. Crop failure, COVID-19, but some reason is what's important. And again, don't ignore the verb. Yeah, these three verbs are probably the most common, I would say, used by the performance management examining panel. Describe, explain, and discuss. And you need to appreciate the differences. Okay, I'm keeping an eye on the time here. I've got to be careful, but you know, a description is to describe the main features of something. And certainly a description can help an explanation. You can't explain something without first describing it, but with an explanation, give me an example, give me a reason. And if you give me a reason and an example, that's better. So if I said zero-based budgeting and I describe the process, that's not an explanation of the process, is it? Why do we create decision packages? Why do we justify the expenditure? And if you don't do that in an explain requirement, you can't score. So an example and a why on top of a description gives you an explanation. Discussion questions will be set in balance areas. So there has to be an element of judgment. So you need to show the positive numbers or ideas, excuse me, and the negative ideas and have some balance about it. And if you do that, you'll score well. And this was very interesting. Look at this. In relevant cash flow questions. Now, again, you may not be studying PM just yet or about to start, but there's quite a good chance of some relevant cash flow questions again in section C here, where half the marks are for explanation of your answer. Half. So if you've got a 20-mark relevant cash flow question, 10 marks are for the calculation, and 10 marks are for saying why you've put the numbers in your answer. Half. Just reflect on that. Now, of course, there might be a separate section. It might not be worth as many as 10. Might be, I don't know, 7 marks, a 14-part question, 7 marks for the calculation, 7 marks for the, you know, for the explanations. And notice, look at this. It includes explanation for why something was omitted. So you decide something is not relevant to a decision and therefore you omit it. That's correct. But one thing, if you don't write it down and say it's omitted, then you can't score for it really. You're much better off to put it in at 0 value and say this isn't relevant. And congratulations, you've just scored yourself 2 more marks for doing no more work. So that's a very important piece of advice. The examiners always comment on the structure of your answers. Very important. Headings and subheadings. You know, you guys will never have marked anything. Well, Alex and I certainly have. And let me assure you, if someone's got good structure, it's easier to mark and students score better. So structure is really important. Okay. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about OT because I was very conscious when I look back over that virtually everything I was saying there was to do with section C, because the examiner's comments do tend to do that, with the exception of showing, for example, 2 objective test questions that went particularly wrong. And remember, that means presumably they were most difficult. Yeah. Generally, the approach in OT should be as follows. First of all, I think you're better off doing the wordy items first. And even if you don't find those necessarily easier, they're certainly quicker. And of course, in CBE, you can go backwards and forwards relatively quickly. I fully accept if the internet connection that you're working with isn't brilliant, that might not be such good advice. And that's up to you to judge, I suppose. Yeah. You should always read the question first and note the format of the answer. So is it a multiple choice, A, B, C, D, which one's right? Is it a multiple response? Do we need 2 right answers or 3? Is it a number entry? If it's a number entry, how many decimal points do you need to make? And I would certainly read the question first and note the format. I would also spend a few seconds looking at the answers just for a moment, and I'll show you why with an example later on, because it might give you an indication of where to start. And it might show you that one of the answers looks a bit what we call an outlier. And I'll talk about that later in a moment, but outliers tend to be wrong, which I'll talk about in a second. So look at the answers first, and it might tell you that if I answer that part of the question, it'll tell me where to go next. I would then work the question very logically and completely. And I would, you know, there's a scratch pad, isn't there? But I'm a bit old-fashioned. You are entitled to paper, and if you want paper, make sure you've got it and you work on the paper. but work logically. One of the problems with multiple choice questions, I think, is people think they can just bash away on the calculator and out will pop an answer. And in my view, that's a disaster. Try and work logically, yeah, and try to finish off. You know, so what I mean by that, it could well be that you're working logically. You've got, let's say, 200 hours as an answer multiplied by $5 an hour equals 1,000. If you don't finish, yeah, and stop at the 200, you might find that's one of the distractors. That's one of the answers. So make sure you finish, get to the 1,000 before you then select an answer. And of course, at that point, sometimes I'm afraid it's not there, is it? We have to reflect on that. Probably 30% of the time, it's not going to be there because somewhere along the line you've made a mistake. Now, obviously, you can have a look back over your workings, certainly if you've written them down. If you haven't written them down, that'll be more difficult. However, if it's not there and you have to guess, yeah, you obviously might as well put something. What would you do? Well, here's some tips. Now, this isn't just tips I've made up. This was a study from a Liverpool St John's Moore University a professor came up with 1 or 2 ideas, and I picked out the best ones. First of all, if 2 answers, A, B, C, D, if 2 answers are opposites, one of them is almost certainly right. And the reason for that is that distractors have to be distractors, not just wrong answers. I mean, I've written thousands of multiple choice questions in the past. I'm always employed by different colleges to write questions. And one of the big challenges is to get a good distractor. So if I've got an answer, which I know the answer is, if you like, 2,000 favourable, the easiest distractor in the world is then 2,000 adverse. It's clearly a reasonable distractor because it's the same numerical value, it just differs in terms of direction. The same is true of a plus number and a minus number. If I calculate something and it's a cost of 500, yeah, I might say a cost saving of 500 could be an opposite. It's quite common, it's not always the case, but if you are having to guess, then one of those opposites will be right. Equally, outliers, numbers that are way out of line with the rest of them, are very, very, very often wrong. So I would avoid them. Yeah. Equally, there's no tricks and traps here from the ACCA. They're a genuine organisation trying to get you through the exam. If you haven't heard of something, then it's wrong. Yeah. And equally, don't try and second guess the examiner. That's sometimes people get in that mindset. I wonder what I'm supposed to put here. Don't do that. It's not a trap. Okay. Equally, sometimes, supposing you've got, you know, 4 different variances, some will be adverse, some will be favourable. Perhaps if you just can read the question again and say, is there any hints here on direction? Maybe the hint is it's adverse, and that will be enough to help you guess. Okay. In section B, you know, we mentioned this earlier. In section B, if a subsequent item requires the answer to a previous item, then unfortunately the ACCA's own rules says they've got to give that answer in the subsequent part. Hard to explain that, but in part B, you're asked to work out contribution. If you need that contribution for part C, the rules say that in part C they will give it. And if you give it, it's right. So check back in part B to see whether you got that answer as well. That's becoming less and less, and instead what they're doing is writing wordy questions and getting better at that at section B writing. Section B exam questions to write are notoriously difficult. You know, just to illustrate a couple of these things here, if you look at those 4 answers, so you read the question, what is the total number of units that must be made and sold to make a profit of 45,000? Yeah, 7,5, 12,5, so 22,5, 15 and 16,875. This one, if I was guessing, looks a little bit out of line with the rest. Would you agree? And I would describe that as an outlier, right? So if I am guessing, yeah, I'd probably guess at one of the others. Yeah, it doesn't often happen this, and of course we're only talking about in desperation, aren't we? In desperation, if you can't get the answer, what are you guessing? Yeah, you look at this one, which are the following statements about throughput accounting ratio for the previous week is or are true. Look at the answers, 3 only, 2 only, 1 and 2, 1 and 3. When you get something like this, if you notice, if for instance you start with 3, yeah, if you start with 3 and 3 is true, Yeah, if that's the case, would you agree that suggests therefore that B and C can't be right, and therefore all you're doing then is can you look at A, sorry, number one, and answer that question. So that's what I meant earlier by saying that sometimes when you look at the answers, there's a hint, if you like, where to start. So I would say there you could start at 3, or to be fair, you could also start at 2. But you can start at somewhere and it will give you a hint, because what most people do here is they'll answer the question 1, 2, and 3 without really thinking about the consequences. And you don't need to do that. You can save a little bit of time by not doing that. Okay, so I would say the examiner's comments are really important. Yeah, and it's a person. The examiner's a person. It's easy to make them faceless. And they've got their frustrations, and they've got their interests, and they've got their wishes, and they're trying to make a better profession for us all. That's what they're trying to do. So read the examiner's comments and appreciate what this person's saying, because if they express concern about an approach, you can pretty much be certain they'll examine it again. And don't remember, you're not looking necessarily. I have no problem with you looking at the most recent examiner's comments, but if you're taking the exam in September or December, look back a little bit more, because that's when the examiner's report would have been written. That's when your exam would have been written. And make a use of these study support resources, because there's lots of them and they're really excellent. So I'm going to hand back to Alex, and he's going to talk about 1 or 2 other points.
Amazing, Jeff. No, absolutely fantastic. And just a big thank you to you personally, and obviously the hard work that you put in, the experience that you've brought here. The feedback's been fantastic already, and we've not even finished. We've had some great questions come in. Some of the things that I've been taking notes of as we've gone along is around, the importance of exam technique, question practice. You talked about, the wordy questions versus the numbery questions and getting the right balance. Also, just to reiterate, the emphasis on resources, which I'll talk through in a second. So whether that's the articles or the examining team guidance, which I've provided links for the audience as well. And I really liked what you said about, the section C questions, breaking them down, but also then these OT guidance that you just gave around outliers, the inverse of trying to figure out which ones are wrong first sometimes. And if worst case scenario comes along, which ones to discard to then keep moving through your exam. It's been really enjoyable. If you could move to the next slide, I'll just talk about some specific resources, and then we will have time towards the end as well. We've still got a little over 10 minutes for some questions. So just for the audience as well, please keep asking questions. You've had some great ones so far, and Jeff and I will do our best to answer them as we go along. So we've already talked a little bit about the study support resources. These are free resources available to you as ACCA students for any of the exams that you wish to take. Now, specifically for performance management, you can go in and you can follow the link that I've already sent, and you can find past exams, examiners' articles, examiner guidance. This fantastic document, if you can see me waving around, this is the examiner's reports that we're talking about today. You can find these online as well. You can find videos as well to give you guest lectures, CB platforms. There's so much on there. If you haven't used it just yet because you're just starting out, or maybe you've never really got engaged with it before, please do. There's so much value to be had on there. Jeff, you can move to the next one. There's also the Virtual Learning Centre, which is fantastic for many reasons, particularly in our region in the Middle East. We've got support for students who maybe English isn't their first language. So there are English modules on listening and reading tests. There's also mathematical modules to try and do some self-checks, interactive learning to see if your math skills are up to scratch as well. And in addition, there's also a new section on there with self-check quizzes and preparation for those students who maybe just want to, maybe come in with exemptions from management, accountancy or other papers, and they want to just do a little bit of a knowledge check to see whether they're up to scratch in terms of the broad knowledge of performance management or some of the other exams. This leads me quite nicely onto the next in terms of support. So Jeff, you could flick through for me. We highly advocate the need and sort of the value of our approved learning partners, some fantastic learning partners all around the region, all around the world, and even online now, given the huge demand for online learning. But do go on our website. I will provide that link now. You can go onto our Middle East hub, you can go onto our ACCA website, find our learning partner directory and find a learning partner in your country, which will be able to support you through your ACCA journey. So that leads me quite nicely to the sort of Q&A section, which I think is the next slide, Jeff, if that's right. Fantastic. We've got a little under 10 minutes. I'm sure we can stretch that out. Jeff, you got anywhere to run off to?
No, not at all.
Good stuff. Well, what we'll do is I'll start off with a question that came in earlier, and it was from Nyan, and it was a great question actually. It says, what approach should we adopt in doing this exam? Should we start with section C?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, that, isn't it? I mean, we all have our own opinion, because I know, Alex, your background is of a tutor nature, isn't it, as well? I mean, you know, I don't know what you're going to say. Most people, I think, quite like the idea that the objective test questions get them warmed up, because what you don't want is your first question to be a disaster. And so that, for example, in the past where exams have choice in them, well, there's no choice in this one, it's really interesting conversation about, well, which one would you choose? And that's not relevant here, so I shall restrain myself from talking about that. But the objective testing, if you do get a question wrong and you have a bit of a disaster, it is only 2 marks sacrificed. So personally, I would certainly be starting, I think, with section A, get myself warmed up. I'd certainly be doing the wordy bits, the wordy ones first, because getting them right or wrong, it doesn't take very long. Whereas the numbers ones can take an awful lot longer. And I would do section A first. Then it's almost personal preference. It might well be that you've seen a section C question which you like the look of, and that's also another nice sort of way of thinking about it. I'm going to do section A first. I'm going to have a look at section C. If there's something I look of, maybe I should do it, because it's 20 marks. The last thing you want, would you agree, is to run out of time in doing a section C question, because you're sacrificing so much. You know, section B, yes, there's 3 questions there of 5 parts each. It's 30 marks, but if you miss out, you won't miss out a whole question. You'll just miss out a part of a question, sacrificing 2. So I would say those 2 things. I personally would start with section A. I would do the wordy bits first. I'd then have a look at C, and certainly if I like the look of the questions, I might do that. Because in the last few minutes of an exam, hey, you know, you can guess at an OT item that you don't know the answers to, but you can't do that for section C. I don't know whether, Alex, you've got a different view.
No, I think it's you know, it's really insightful, that warm up element. There's always an element of nerves when you get into any exam, particularly these professional exams, and you know, having a game plan is extremely important. Knowing where you're going to start and warming yourself up on the sort of, I don't want to say easier because they're not easier, but more smaller questions are more palatable to then build your confidence. But also, you know, as rightly said, if you have a little bit of a speed bump, it doesn't knock you too much in terms of the mark allocation. Thank you very much. We've got plenty of questions coming in, so I'll keep them coming. Yusuf asked this one earlier, and I believe it is in relation to section C as well, and we've had a few other questions around section C. So how detailed does the implication or comment need to be? And someone's also asked in relation to section C, how do we answer it in regards to the scenario as well? So I think they're linked quite nicely together.
Okay, yeah, that's a very good question, actually, because it's always a concern for someone, isn't it, how much to write. Supposing you're doing a variance calculation, and supposing you've calculated, let's imagine, you know, correctly 200 favourable. Yeah, obviously an incorrect answer will be 200 adverse, and I'll just deal with what happens if you get it wrong that way and what's important. You know, for the comments, and I will answer that question in a second. For the comments, it's not the 200 that matters, is it? For the comments, what matters is the direction. It doesn't matter whether it's 200 adverse, 500 adverse, 7,000 adverse. It's the direction that will determine what you then say. So it's always worth, before you start making a comment, just checking that you've got the direction right. The examiners do say, in fairness, that even if you got the direction wrong, they'll try and give follow-on marks. You won't get punished twice. But in my experience, that's really difficult to do you've got the wrong direction. You're saying opposite things. So be careful with direction. Now, bear in mind here, in terms of the actual question, there was the level of detail, wasn't it? Bear in mind here, what we're dealing with is performance management. We're not dealing with advanced performance management. So therefore, there's a gap, and the APM takes these ideas and takes them forward. I mean, APM is a great exam in my view, but what I would say, therefore, is maybe 1 sentence, maybe at most 2 sentences will be enough. So, and to make it real, so if you're looking at a favourable variance, let's suppose it's a material price variance, as long as you're not contradicting the scenario, and I'll talk about scenario in a minute, as long as you're not contradicting the scenario, anything that is feasible will score. So if you've got a favourable material vice variance, yeah, what you need to go beyond saying, therefore we've bought cheaper, because that's just a mathematical truth. Of course we've bought cheaper, it's a favourable price variance. It's better to say why that might be. Maybe we've bought poorer quality, because that's why it's cheaper. Maybe we've used a cheaper supplier, and that's all you need to say. If it's referred to in the scenario, then you can make a reference to that. You know, maybe there's a crop failure mentioned in the scenario, and that's what's led to the weaker quality, and that's, you know, it's forced the prices downwards. Of course, crop failures might force the prices upwards, but what you mustn't do is contradict the scenario, and using the scenario as much as possible by using the correct terminologies. So don't say product in the answer. If the business is selling, oh, I don't know, let's just suppose the business is selling wheat, say wheat. Use the correct terminology, and that's almost enough at the performance management level. The answers very often are in the question, so all you got to do is contribute towards that, add a little bit of value. So that's sort of what I would say. You don't have to do much, but you do have to do something. And almost, if you like, two separate points, two separate ideas is better than one long one, in my opinion. Because equally, normally at the PM level, a tick really can't score you much more than one. So what you want is two short comments to get 1 and 1, rather than one very long comment, yeah, and you might only score 1. So I would say a little bit less, but a little bit wider in terms of frequency. That makes sense. Do you see what I mean? So you make 2 comments rather than 1, but keep it short. You don't have to say very much.
Yeah, brilliant, Jeff. No, I think that's really insightful, because sometimes students can either waffle, which is a colloquial term for writing too much in a tangent, or not enough, or sometimes they don't write anything, which is massively surprising if they go to the trouble of actually performing the calculation. They get the number right, but they miss out on doubling their marks effectively by not expanding their comments enough. We've got time for one more question, and I think this is perfect for you, Jeff, because I know you've written thousands of questions, and I want to advocate for students that the value of practicing questions and exams to time in exam conditions, but also the value of using the practice sort of platforms, the approved learning partner content, the questions that you've written, Jeff. Many are asking now, this is from Ahmed directly, what do you think of the level of the practice questions? Are they high level? There are some easy ones, and maybe what they're trying to get at, how do they compare to the real exam? Now, I know the answer to this, but I'd love it from your perspective.
When you say practice questions, are we talking about practice questions in the revision kit, or
yeah, revision kit on the ACCA website, just all of them that are out there from your purview, so the really good quality ones?
Well, I would say that the big publishers, and of course there's the Kaplan, there's the BPPs. I don't want to sort of, there's no bias here. There's lots and lots of different providers of questions. They try very hard to make them reflect the real exam standard. Yeah, they do try very hard. So I would say that they're a reasonable attempt at the level of difficulty that you might expect. I don't know whether you've got a slightly different view there, Alex. You mentioned that you had a view.
No, I mean, it's just a case of, obviously, people like yourself and then the approved learning partners, approved content providers, they work with their experience and obviously the ACCA to produce the exam standard questions. So when students sometimes find that they're harder or easier, ultimately their exam questions are also harder and easier. And sometimes you might get a question in your exam that's extremely difficult. But likewise, that's in line with the practice questions, the exam kits that are created out there. So they're all on par, in my opinion, and from the experience. And
I agree with that. I mean, also, I know from first-hand experience that the examiner is given a copy of the book, and they say, "Well, what do you think about this?" And the examiner will be expected, or the examining panel will be expected to form an opinion. That these books are not approved learning materials for nothing; they've been studied. I remember looking at textbooks from different providers and passing comments, and I can assure you that these publishing businesses are hugely professional. And if the examiner says you need a little bit more on this or a little bit less on that, they're definitely going to reflect that. And I would say all the approved learning providers, all the publishers produce very, very high quality materials. Of course, remember the examining comments Examiner's comments also produce a couple of OTs each individual report, so you can see the sorts of things that they have asked and you can compare them.
Thank you, Jeff. Right, we're coming to a close, so if you could just flick to the next slide for me, because I think this is important for students. If they want to get in touch, our contact details are here. So we've got our email address, our telephone, but also I've provided the Middle East Content Hub as the last thing in the chat panel. So you can go directly on there and get in touch with us directly. I'm sure you can reach out to Jeff as well. I'm sure he'd be more than happy. He talked earlier about his LinkedIn and some of the free groups that he has available for students. So thank you for that. Jeff, I'm just going to hand it back to you for maybe 1 or 2 closing comments and the sort of, the overall big sort of take homes for the students from your perspective.
Yeah, and before I do that, I think I would emphasize that, on LinkedIn, there are, I set up little groups for students studying specific papers. I mean, don't be shy, join in the groups and we share ideas. I put out points on a fairly regular basis. I mean, I provide courses for APM and PM. So, hey, there'll be a group on LinkedIn, reach out and, hey, I'll be there and we'll talk about it. I mean, I would say, in terms of reflecting on what we've talked about there, is that it's really important to start in the right place with your studies, so you don't go off and gung-ho and start reading a textbook and reading a syllabus. I think starting with the exams makes an awful lot of sense. It gives you a guide as to what level of detail that you need to adopt. I would also say be a little bit careful with your exemption. We didn't talk about that too much. Was it well earned? You will know that, because some of these things are directly testable. Choose a tutor very sensibly, because a tutor should support you. If you've got an exemption, I take the view that, look, it's up to me to get you through PM, even though you've had the exemption. So I would certainly suggest that you do that, and read the examiner's comments, because they come up with absolute gems. And if you follow the advice given by the examiner, I think you've got a much better chance of success. I would say that.
Amazing. Thank you, Jeff. We will bring it to a close now. I mean, what a fantastic hour. I'm sure the audience and those who are watching it back will be in touch. So thank you very much. And for everybody who joined us, have a great day. And Jeff, I'll catch up with you tomorrow. Do take care, everyone.
Okay. Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.